Through a Window observes the polyrhythms of aesthetics, theory, pedagogy, technology, and politics that inform the movement of artists through the classroom, the studio, the gallery, and the city, locally and internationally in linear and cyclical, continuous, and punctuated circuits. Sara Diamond has played a significant role in forming and expanding these circuits around video, media art, and electronic art. Though by no means an exhaustive list of her achievements, this includes video research and storytelling through the production of the Women's Labor History Project at SFU, artist-run organizing, collaboration, and interdisciplinarity at the Satellite Video Exchange Society and the Western Front, media activism and feminist representation with Amelia Productions, aesthetic innovation and experimentation at the Banff New Media Institute, historical analysis and criticism in the publication of Euphoria and Dystopia, mobile media and data visualization through CodeZebra.net and the Center for Innovation in Information Visualization and Data-Driven Design, and last but not least, pedagogical discourse in her role as a president of OCAD University in Toronto. It is an honor to welcome Sara back to Vancouver to reflect on her breadth of experience and share with us her thoughts on the promise of disruption in the early days of analog media production and its endurance, failures, and transformations in contemporary media and electronic arts. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to try and set my timer here. There, that's good. Okay. So I want to, first of all, formally acknowledge that the city of Vancouver is on the unceded traditional territory of the First Salish people, and thank them for the guardianship of this place. Beginning in the 1960s, Vancouver's hyperactive media art scene was a hotbed of experimentation, collaboration, technical play, and radical engagement with the proliferation of organizations engaged with media art. I'm going to dip in and out of this history, provide some personal points of engagement, and try and give a bit of the flavors of the time, and discuss in particular what emerged as what I've defined as 9 points of disruption. These are intensive and productive radicalization, kind of left coast, as it was called, and counterculture, Marxism, labor, and feminisms, interdisciplinary experience and collaboration, particularly relevant with early computer arts, institutional partnerships that came and went. They provided resources. Large institutions stepped away when the outputs were too radical, stepped back in or were drawn in. Fourth, a blend of post-secondary and new sites of experiential learning, leaders who came from inside and outside of the academy. Fifthly, a powerful, autonomous and semi-autonomous artists organizations which exist to this day. Profound internationalism and address of cultural race politics, indigenous media, arts expression, which really flourished, kind of epicenter for anti-censorship activities, and intense sociality. This was a party town, hopefully still is, drug scene, music scene, other than Montreal, the Canadian city to be and come out in. Yeah. The club scene and the party scene. I guess I said that already. So, this talk is drawn from oral history, interviews with some colleagues, a series of interviews I undertook in 1990, and a lot of kind of going back into my own archives. If you want to know more, don't miss Stan Douglas's edited volume of Vancouver Thought Anthology and Making Video In, edited by Jennifer Abbott, and there's a really great work that's recently done by the Grant on the Main Streeters, and of course there's fantastic archives for the Western Front. So anyhow, the two directions of the utopian movement of the late 60s and early 70s media counterculture described by Martha Rossler were especially pronounced on the west coast of Canada. The convergence of the social movements of the 60s and early 70s with the countercultural, quote, utopian populist rationalist qualities of the hippie scene, and the, I quote, progressive, rationalist, anti-sexist, and anti-imperialist, unquote, but equally utopian, and now I would also add equally countercultural movement of the New Left. So as Nancy Shaw has suggested, and artists from this period confirmed, McLuhanism had engaged the imagination of artists, intellectuals, and elites I quote, McLuhan considered artists to be a special group of perception experts who could, through experimentation with new technology, create a situation where humor and innovation pierce the habitual. Artists were to become educators of the future, unquote. Hank Bull captures the sentiment of the times. He said, global consciousness was something I felt and wanted to evoke in my work, right from the beginning. Buckminster Fuller was an important influence, Spaceship Earth, along with the Yippies, the Black Panthers, Black American music, and other mentors were W.S. Burroughs and his message of linguistic, imaginary, and sexual liberation, and Robert Filio with his eternal network and, quote, art is what makes life more interesting than art. I believed then, and still do, that the positive aspects of the networks, I'm still quoting Hank, collaborative communication, understanding across difference, basic global humanity will outweigh the negative side. Surveillance, propaganda, commodification, control, if only just barely. Unquote. At the same time as McLuhan's rising popularity, there emerged a materialist critique of mass media provoked by Hans Magnus Eisenberg and Alvin Gudner, and predicated on Walter Benjamin's early writings, which saw social production increasingly centralized in the mass media, but argued also that mass media, like other means of production, could be seized, socialized, democratized, and run by its workers. These views resonated well within a province where politics had long polarized along left-right splits, and where there was a powerful union movement, women's and emerging social movements, Marxist ideas and applications for many schools of thought, feminist, New Left, communist, Frankfurt School, Weimar, were present in institutional settings, from unions to community organizations, the women's movement, and university cultures. In the 1960s, Vancouver was a refuge to many young American draft resistors who had moved north and been influenced by other hippie and radical cultures and brought their talent and their ideas to Simon Fraser University, UBC, and the Vancouver School of Art now, and the Carter University of Art and Design. As Dan Claxton, activist and artist, Indigenous activist and artist, states it, quote, I guess they don't call it the left coast for nothing. I moved to the West Coast when I was 22, and everywhere I went, there was a politic. I worked at the Georgia Strait and quit because they would not stop running red-hot video ads, unquote. European settlement had only been present for just over a century in the 1960s. Kate Craig, founder of the Western Front, said, quote, there's a tremendous freedom in Vancouver, much less of a burden of history and European culture than there is in Eastern Canada. This has had a tremendous influence on me, and I would think on a lot of people in Vancouver, especially those who've grown up here. There's such a strong influence of Asian culture here. The color, the food, it can't help but affect you, end of quote. In fact, Vancouver represents unceded Indigenous territory, and despite the disruptions of residential schools and political intervention, powerful Indigenous groups and organizations existed in the 70s and onwards into this day. Institutional partnerships. Eager to stimulate and inspire creativity on Vancouver's West Coast, academics from UBC, SFU, and the Vancouver School of Art, and the Canadian Broadcasting Commission, the CBC, staff and independents in the cultural scene connected Vancouver to the international arts and alternate music worlds, particularly in the US. The Crucible Festival of Contemporary Art at UBC, initiated in 1961, ran for a decade and brought in leading international figures such as Merce Cunningham, Stan Brakhage, Robert Creeley, Yvonne Rainier, to mix with local artists. Marion Penner Bancroft insists that, thanks to the festival, change, quote, came from the outside, unquote, to the city. Simon Fraser University provided a home for Merce, Alwyn Nicholas, who came from the Laban Hanye Holm line of dance, and Martha Graham. Marshall McLuhan lectured at the Design Gallery with Arts Club support, and impresario Jamie Reed introduced be-ins with bands such as Country Joe, the Jefferson Airplane, playing at the Russian Hall, and Janis Joplin at the appropriately named Trip Festival. Reed insists that despite counterculture influences, the other social movements, those against the war in Vietnam and civil rights, had a more powerful effect. Ebrin Rodnotnik, who taught at UBC, describes a resulting environment that was intimate yet disruptive, quote, transmitting the sense of excitement, the sense of doing something new, doing something for the first time, experiencing something that we hadn't experienced before, unquote. The emergence of powerful autonomous and semi-autonomous artist institutions came from this mix of international influences and powerful university aspirations towards interdisciplinarity. It resulted in the creation of Intermedia in 1967, an umbrella for artists, educators, and influential leaders of the Vancouver community, touched by non-Western thought, drugs, technological counterculture as well. And its disciplines embraced sound, sculpture, poetry, video, performance, happenings, dance, fashion, cooking, craft, printmaking, photography, and filmmaking. Over its 6 years, according to Krista Dahl, it focused on collaborative cultural expression, new institutional models, and educational transformation, shifting artists' relationship with their audiences to address a broader public and enable the co-creation of artwork, so that's one of its aspirations. And technology was central to its mandate. Artists articulated a missionary role, quote, new concerns and criteria in education and communications that utilize the technology that we have evolved in the continuous and urgent need to explore new perspectives of our human use and our ecology. Quote, unquote, affirming that, quote, in a world of such staggering complexity and fierce rate of change, artists have moved quickly and deftly to the use of new electronic technologies as their most effective means of expression, unquote. This thinking, of course, can also be seen as a hope that technology would solve Canada's growing economic and cultural identity crisis. Its stated mandate to bring together the potential of art, science, and industry was hailed as a new alchemy by journalists such as Catherine Fairborn, who said theories put forward by McLuhan and others would be subjected to suitably controlled tests and experimentation. Any aid that computers could make to communication would be explored, and specialists in cybernetics would participate in research, unquote. Kind of sounds familiar to some of what is said today. Intermedia collaborated with established institutions, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the satellite galleries and community centers, and there were intermediate nights in 1968, the Electric Connection Show of 69, modeled on experiments in art and technology in New York, and the Dome Show in 1970. Intermedia undertook initiatives in education and citizens media, opened an experimental kindergarten and a free high school, but with a loose affiliation with Simon Fraser University faculty. And Michael Goldberg and Krista Dahl, who went on to found Video In SV Satellite Video Exchange Society, worked in the extension program, which included the artists in the schools. Other Video In founders, Paul Wong and Sean Preuss, who were teens, fell instantly in love with the video camera and its potential thanks to this program. And Krista Dahl insists that the important work that women undertook, in great part as educators as well as artists in Intermedia, has been erased from history. She said, and I quote, 1/3 of Intermedia were women. We had a big show at the Vancouver Art Gallery. We did a lot of work in the schools, and there was experimental art in the afternoons every single day, unquote. And I must say, I found photos in the archive where the men were named and the women were not. So it was very interesting. So Intermedia had received an unprecedented grant for $40,000 from the Canada Council for the Arts, $21,500 from a donor foundation to undertake citizen media activities and establish a citizens media production arm, Metro Media, after an extensive lobby from the not-for-profit sector, the National Film Board, and the universities. Finding itself with resources to spend, Intermedia promptly dissolved in 1972. Fearful of becoming bureaucratic, and because internal tensions, according to Sean Preuss, in particular, film versus video, feminism versus egocentrism, art versus citizens media were expressed as specializations that warranted more focused initiatives. Preuss continues, and I quote, dancers were alienating everyone. Writers were disorganized but wanted more of a formal organization, created the BC Writers Guild. People wanted, who were more traditional, went towards film. There was a rift between Video In and Metro Media. Video In was considered artsy, and Metro Media was traditional and opposed to artists taking equipment out, unquote. Western Front co-founder Hank Bull saw it differently, with centers finding their appropriate audiences, mandate, and relationship to the question of art practice and democracy. So a number of institutions began, Metro Media, as I mentioned, Citizens and Community Access, Western Front, formerly the New Era Social Club in '73, the Satellite Video Exchange Society, Real Feelings Women's Collective, Women in Focus in '74, and the CRTC in 1975 regulated co-op radio, which served as a model for artist community-controlled broadcast media, and younger artists established Pump Center for the Arts in 1975. What a prolific world. A factor in Intermedia's dissolution may also have been the withdrawal of support from the Vancouver Art Gallery. Swept up in the movement for change of the 1960s, the director of the VAG, Tony Emery, had supported Intermedia in the many events in the Vancouver scene, collaborating closely with Doris Shadbolt. As the 70s advanced, and with it intensified social polarization, Emery left the gallery under pressure from a board that, according to Kathy Fogg, wanted to revert to a more traditional practice, including highlighting its collection. We see one of the first waves of tension between artist centers and efforts and formal institutions. On the heels of Intermedia's breakup in the 1973 Matrix Conference was organized by Michael Goldberg and Tricia Harding and brought over 140 practitioners from Japan, Canada, US, France, UK, and attracted many Canadian organizations, establishing deep ties between Vancouver and the international media, arts, and documentary communities. Michael Goldberg, influenced by McLuhan's free flow of communication, shaken with a little Marcusean leftist twist against state disinformation, established the first international video exchange directory in 1972, from which SBS and Video In and then Video Out in 1980 flowed. Access to the means of production underlay these initiatives. As Paul Wong, noted Vancouver artist, has said, quote, the emergence and availability of consumer-priced, non-broadcast dominated technology, the Portapack, made it possible to go out to the field and to work outside the conventions and traditional confines of broadcast television and previous models that were the only models in the past, unquote. According to Paul, after Intermedia, and I quote, the Video In was a more focused zeroing in on video, and that collaboration included experimental avant-garde arts and collaboration with educators and political activists, the American Indian movement, Black Panthers, feminists, queers, that word came later, and lesbians, who all intersect with each other in the idea of DIY media and advocacy. And I quote, it was the dawn, I continue with Paul's quote, it was the dawn of the artist-run center movement that modeled itself on the same structures of public art institutions. Wait a minute, we can do that too. All of that came out of the DIY movement of the 60s. If you cannot wait for institutions to transform, do it yourself. Take advantage of nonprofit societies and the act and what it offered you. You could duplicate and mail and video. You could duplicate and mail videotape from around the world and screen in our screening room, set up like a living room, and then you could send it to someone else's gallery. I continue with Paul's quote. We had set up not just an arts organization, we had educational status, and because of this charitable status, and we used this status to work with customs and excise to ensure that anything sent that was marked educational was tax exempt. I was really young, so it happened at the same time as I was walking into the world. I was part of the democratization of media revolution. We just did it. We created alternate models by just doing, unquote. Thank you, Paul. In its early years, the Video In had a family-like aura, much like the Western Front. It was a live-in community, according to Krista Dahl, and I quote her, we lived on Powell Street and it was a library, and there were 8 of us living together. And that was when I started not throwing anything out, which is why we have a big print collection and archive. We had a big kitchen and a bathroom with a shower, which we also used as a darkroom. And we had lofts where people were sleeping, and people took turns cooking, and there was always something going on. It was truly a library where people came in during the day. The mice, the cockroaches, never bothered me. The bedbugs never bothered me. Sean, Paul, and Jeanette were bitten. We ultimately had to get out of there. In examining, the Video In stayed there, but they stopped living there. I remember the cockroaches, they stayed. In examining these, I didn't know about the bedbugs till I interviewed Krista. I said, oh my God, okay. In examining the institutions that survived and speaking to their members, it is clear that there was a high capacity for collaboration, for disruptive collaboration. To scale up for events or pragmatic activities such as purchasing videotape. For example, Women in Focus, the Feminist Center, and the Video In both took anti-censorship stands in the mid-1980s, I hope I get to that part of the paper, onwards, and erected a series of incredible collaborative events. Hank Bull notes, and I quote, "There are many examples of cooperation between artist centers, universities, and large institutions like the Vancouver Art Gallery. It's a small town. To make things happen, you have to work together. Vivo and the Front often partnered, while at the same time filling clearly separate roles. Now, when it came to something big, like Strategies for Survival, the international conference that took place as a site of resistance to Expo 86, all the centers worked together. The Vancouver Artists League was the umbrella group formed to produce this event. It later became the Pacific Association of Artist-Run Centers, or PARC," unquote. So the artist-run centers were responsible for production, distribution, critical discourse, and curation. Video art remained on the margins, and hence publication was extremely important. The creation of Video Guide was a critical act. Zeynep Verjee, who worked at various artist-run centers, stated, and I quote, "Those early writings are about what the relationship between culture and technology is, and that is the making of Canadian national identity," unquote. The Western Front, oops, I'm going to just move it forward here because I missed some really great slides. Oh, sorry. The Western Front was an artist-owned, fully curated environment. By this I mean it supported its own founders' work and then built a powerful program of artist residencies and new works production. It was deeply influenced by countercultural values, data, humor, and technological experimentation. It supported video art and installation, visual art, music, dance, performance, and early computer, radio art, sound, and multicasting experiments. Their early programs provided resources to artists such as Willie Wegman and Joan Jonas, who in turn became a resource for other artists, building the international network. The late Kate Craig, founder of the New Era Social Club and the Western Front, described the lifestyle philosophy of the Western Front. She said, "I don't think that there has been anybody at the front ever who's aligned themselves with any political faction. Nobody belongs to the Anarchist Party of Canada. Nobody even belongs to the unions. It's not so much a critique as it is an alternative, a way of dealing with one's life 24 hours a day, how one relates to the outside world or one's community. The motivation behind a lot of the work is positive. It's about being able to find resources, people, buildings, and facilities to produce something new. It's never been a school, there's never been a manifesto, there's never been an overt affiliation except with other artists," unquote. And Zeynep Verjee, who became the first artistic director of the Front in the 1990s, still says there was a politics, unquote. And I quote her, "This art comes from the avant-garde, fluxus spaces, where they refuse to say art is political. But Robert Filio, art is life, yet the work is political. Work like Hank's HP Radio with Patrick Reddy. First Artist Broadcast, a model for audio art. And Mona Hatoum comes in and does Measures of Distance. Measures of Distance, a very poetic work, but in the street. What we would now describe as networked art, and Hank Bull insists social media at the time, found a home at the Western Front. Fax party events were common, as was slow scan. The Western Front became a center for slow scan, as I just said. Hank Bull, quote, worked with Bill Bartlett of Direct Media on Pacific Rim slow scan art. This led to participation in many network projects of the 1980s. La Plaisir du Texte with Electra Paris in 1983, Planetary Network at the Venice Biennale in 86, and Hank continues and says throughout this period and since, an occasional series of exchanges called Vancouver linked to Vancouver, linking Vancouver and Vienna as a kind of virtual city in the ether have existed. For VideoIn's 5th anniversary party, the Front and VideoIn created a slow scan event with Willoughby Sharp from New York and a VideoIn party, in Paul Wong's terms, one of the best studio parties of the year for 250 or so guests. That's from Tattle Tape, but I have a feeling it was Paul. And I quote, slow scan messages were sent and received through the evening with mutual birthday greetings from Granada Grizel from General Idea. Cornelia Weingarten describes the quality of these events and infers the need for a party atmosphere. She said, slow scan, which was interesting, but I could never stick it out to see if anything interesting was being expressed because of my impatience. Slow scan. In retrospect, there is evidence, she said, that remarkable events happen at a long distance. So, we can't forget the parties. The creative scene that emerged in the 1970s was heavily blended through multiple decades of Vancouver's committed party culture, known as Lotus Land in the 70s and 80s, gay, lesbian, transsexual, and bisexual, queer was not yet in the vocabulary, and before the incisor teeth of the AIDS crisis hit. With powerful expressions of feminist arts and culture, both straight and lesbian, Commercial Drive was also known as Lesbian Lane, an art scene party event culture in part predicated on club and space rentals because of the city's peculiar licensing laws, and a very hot punk, new wave, and jazz scene, as well as house parties on Main Street and Vancouver's East End. Performance art events added to the mix, and the music scene integrated itself into the emerging video art scene, especially at the Video Inn and Metro Media. Paul Wong describes the location draw of the Video Inn. There was a coming together of young emerging musicians, fashion designers, and the punk scene, the zine scene who were hungry and eager, and certainly with video as a documentation tool, presentation, and stage device. An emergence of music video then created an opportunity, Paul said. So, I want to talk a little bit about the informal nature of learning, and these are some great images of Kate Craig at the Western Front with Jeanette Reinhardt. I'm just catching up with my slides, with Mona Hatum's residency, and of course the critique of television. Okay. The environment of DIY experiential learning was often an unrecognized product of institutional experimentation, including high schools in the case of the Main Streeters and universities in the case of intermedia. Artist-run centers were home to self-taught and academically trained individuals. It is important to recognize that in Vancouver, a generation of artists and curators emerged who did not attend art school or university and nonetheless have had a formative intellectual impact, in part because as these emerged, the centers supplied theory as well as practice. In Paul's words, I quote him, "I never had a career path. I wasn't doing video to get into theater. I wasn't doing video to become a musician or a music producer. I wasn't curating to get a job as a curator. I wasn't getting jobs or teaching to get tenure track. I wasn't doing what I was doing to be a feature film director. I wasn't doing one thing to get to two things, to get to four things, to get to my career. This was my career." So to have a system that allowed me as much creative freedom as possible was what I needed. Networking, exchange, exporting, importing, creative exchange. The institution, the Video Inn, provided so much, it just kept evolving and allowed for it and me to grow, unquote. Cornelia Weingarten explains the importance of access in terms of social class. She said, and I quote her, "Class and circumstance prevented me from coming forward in many situations. I had been wanting to become a filmmaker, but that seemed very remote. Once I did get video production equipment put into my hands by the members of the Video Inn, I found it was really easy to progress," unquote. And of course, Cornelia became one of Vancouver's major video artists. Karen Knight, now archivist at Vivo, Video In and Out, was a formidable curator and theorist. She was a photo finisher in Surrey. Her instructor in an art course at Kwantlen College, Alicia Richardson, brought Paul Wong into her class. His collaborative exhibition, Confused Sexual Views, had just been cancelled by the Vancouver Art Gallery because of its new director, Luc Rambaud, had declared it as, I quote, "not art," unquote, because of its pseudo-ethnographic, documentary-based approach to exploring sex. Karen remembers, "The minute that Paul played his tapes," I'm quoting Karen, "I was drawn to the medium. Paul came in a state of, to the ramparts. It was really appealing to me." And that was how I came into Vivo. It was not deliberately chosen. I just fell into video art culture. Now, it was not just a desperate housewives thing. I got totally wrapped up in the nature of what Vivo was because it conveyed a sense of being a place of possibilities. So many things were happening there. There was a connection to feminism and social justice issues. 1984, I worked with Paul Wong as his girl Saturday, and then I would bus him from Surrey and make him coffee while Paul's whole complex scene unfolded around me. I went on to work with Jeanette Reinhardt on the library and the archives, unquote. So Video Inn did play a role in bringing the Academy and the Artist-Run Center movement into one space through the VidCrit lecture series that I organized with titles such as In Critical Territory, Panoptic Video, and Feminine Objection. Motion without an end to amplify theoretical and critical assessment of video practice, and through the Video Rampage celebration of emerging video artists, many of them from the art school and universities that Joe Sarahan ran for many years. In 1985, Emily Carr, now the University of Art and Design, asked me to bring my completely independent 12-week video production course at the Video Inn to the art school environment, and I did. So, pronounced internationalism. While the fight for cable access was highly local, and I'm not going to really have time to talk about that, but it's very interesting to understand how much artists tried to convince the Canadian Radio and Television Commission to give them licenses to run a television channel that was artist-focused and documentary-focused, and then to try and contain the cable environment. So we're not going to get to that part of, this turned into a book, but anyhow, that part of the talk. But that fight was about the highly local. From the early days in the Contemporary Arts Festival, internationalism was very much a powerful driver of the media art scene in Vancouver. There was contact with Germany, Denmark, France, Spain, Italy, the Yugoslavian area, early on, the east coast of Chile, Argentina, and socio-political work from Mexico, Japan, Southeast Asia, Reunion Island, the coast of Africa. There were a tremendous number of artists flowing through the media art scene in Vancouver, both through the residency program of the Western Front and through the Video Ed Library. And it is still home to many international solidarity and development videos. And an article, for example, in Video Guide entitled Development with Video by Arunanda describes the Indian producers group Sendit, who collaborate with subjects of their programs, including development workers, women activists, and union organizers. In the mid to late 80s, there was a shift around the discourse around internationalism as racialized artists began to argue for a different kind of representation of the Canadian art world. The Video Inn and Video Guide reflected these shifts through programming and articles. In 1985, Himani Banerjee's paper From the Heat Is On, Women on Art on Sex, tellingly entitled Now You See Us, Now You Don't, is featured in Video Guide edited by Karen Henri. The series Asian New World, created by Karen Henri and Paul Wong, in 1987 looked at the diverse practice of artists of Asian descent in North America. However, almost everyone that I interviewed acknowledged that one of the most important provocations for this disruption was the November 15th to 19th, 1989 Invisible Colors Festival, a product of collaboration between Zainab Verjee, distribution coordinator at Women in Focus, and Lorraine Chan of the National Film Board of Canada. Zainab Verjee laughs. She says, "People ask me why did Invisible Colors happen in Vancouver? Well, that's because I'm there. I was the first woman of color who Women in Focus hired, and very quickly I began to see that discourse, to push that discourse to the forefront to my work there." We're talking about the mid-80s. My engagement with this is very much along the lines of culture and technology and the place of race and gender within this. It's also about how we can construct a national identity in Canada. What is that identity in post-war Canada? I'm coming from a discourse of post-colonial theory. I'm constantly back and forth to England. I'm informed by the Black British Arts Movement, Rashid Areen, Black Audio Film Collective, Keith Piper, David Bailey, Stuart Hall, Marlene Smith. She's continued. We raised almost $500,000 for a Women of Color event, and we formed alliances with Aboriginal women and within an international movement. All of our money came from development agencies, from NORAD, SEDA. Those of you not from Canada, SEDA was our development agency here, because women's development in the third world is really on the agenda. Those are the people who started funding it, not the Canada Council. There's not a lot of Canadian work we found. It was American and women from 52 countries, such as Tracy Moffat. Verjee's initiative was not welcomed with open arms. She recalls, I quote her, "I went to the Satellite Video Exchange Society and the men teased me. They said, 'What do you think? Should we do a festival for men of color?' Unquote. I never responded because I felt this is not my fight. I'm talking about the whole country. But Kate at the Western Front was behind it." Jasmine Yevani, writing in the introduction, the catalog captures the sentiment of the festival. At the intersection, she said, where race, class, and gender meet stand women of color. They bear the burden and the brutality of these triple forces of oppression perpetuated by patriarchy and colonialism. Their toil in the fields and home goes unacknowledged. Their labor is taken for granted and rendered invisible, yet their images are the most exploited, unquote. Like other attempts to bring race politics to white organizations, it was not a happy ending, resulting in a rupture between Invisible Colors and Women in Focus, with both organizations dissolving. In the early 90s, ANPAC, which was Canada's Artist Run Centre Association, grouping visual and media art centres, imploded over its failure to effectively integrate racialized artists as creators and administrators, and adopt broader understandings of audience. Hank Bull credits Paul Wong's Racy Sexy in 1989 as another watershed exhibition that forever changed the landscape through forcing a dialogue regarding sex and race. And Wong's Yellow Peril, Reconsidered, included 25 artists, filmmakers, and 10 exhibitions which toured Canada and represented, and I quote, something beyond talking about it. Let's see what the other, capital O, can do, unquote, quoting Paul. The Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper, attacked the show as reverse racism. Kara Knights believed that, and I quote her, Video In tried to be different in its hiring practices. It consciously made sure that there were applicants who applied were people of color, yet the changes made don't always stick. It's about having to be constantly proactive so there is no disconnect between the archive of good practice and current practice, end of quote. Feminism in media art. Just check where I am here. Okay. So, the emerging feminist movements gravitated toward video's playful and flexible qualities. Women's media groupings, with the exception of Women in Focus, were transient and productive. Real Feelings was a grouping from intermedia women Naomi Kaplan, Mo Simpson, Renee Bart, Ardell Lister, Sarah Lee James, and bridged experimental and narrative work. Sean Preuss describes it like a women's studies group, providing emotional support, working on each other's production, and acting together. There was humor, fun, and great food. Nomi and Barbara Steinman were interested in a wide audience, and the Women's Media Collective, it didn't last that long. The Women's Media Collective episodically followed, grouped around Peg Campbell of Emily Carr, and it dissolved, also within a year. Women in Focus began at the University of British Columbia as an offshoot of the Women's Office led by Marion Barling. In an article, Women, Media, and Manipulation, Barling states, for women, there is a special interest in investigating how consciousness through ideological forms comes about. Since its inception, public broadcasting has been the domain of men, unquote. Its goals were broadcast and trying to intervene into the educational market and bring the voice that we do not see there into that whole system because it was predominantly male, end of quote. And Video In had a strong feminist agenda reflected in decades of programming, reflected in a 1980 issue of Video Guide, guest edited by Sean Preuss, which, quote, focused on the use of video by feminist individuals and collective efforts. Video has and continues to play an important role for the feminist cause, end of quote. It featured sister organization Women in Focus, Canadian producers, and a memo from women's groups in Japan to provide a counterpoint. 4 by Paul Wong was also featured. Kate Craig, who was the producer of the video residency program at the Western Front, supported many women artists, including My Heroics installation, and in her own practice, she created some challenging pieces about the camera's gaze and proximity to the female body. In Delicate Issue, pun on tissue, her body is panned very close up while she asks a relentless question: at what distance does the camera read? Who is willing to be in the frame? When do I cut out? Volatile and demanding, a reviewer stated about this work. Amelia Productions, a 5-woman lesbian feminist collective, was comprised of Billy Carroll, Sarah Davidson, Ellen Frank, Gay Holly, and moi. And it operated from 1980 to 1982, producing 14 documentary and fictional works, mostly in video, but at times in film. Amelia was home to intensive social tensions, which were a result of intra-collective sex, but also grand debates on the nature of representation. Mary Kelly et al.'s The Night Cleaners came out at this time with Interruption of Verite, and Amelia sought ways to underscore the constructed nature of its work. create narrative suture in others, and hyper-realist narrative about women's lives in yet others. Hardly an Ending, directed by Gay Hawley. Amelia was enabled through access to Rogers Cable 10's production facilities and was in part a spin-off of Ellen, Gay Hawley, and my involvement in the SFU film program, my communication and history studies in the interest of press gang, press members, feminist press, and translating text to image. SFU Fine Arts faculty, Lisa Steele and Clive Robertson, who were there for a summer residency, acted as mentors for Billy Carroll and I when we were enrolled in their course. Amelia's relationship to video was similar to the tactical media movement of the 1980s and early 2000s. We jokingly dubbed our tapes, I quote, occupational videos, unquote, as these were often shot within occupied buildings, daycare centers, and transition houses under threat of closure, the Canada Post Office, struck by its workers, telephone operators in BC Tel, occupied by its workers, the Department of Indian Affairs, occupied by 100 Indigenous women and children. I have delightful memories of sneaking through police lines, heavy porta-packs strapped to my body, camera rolling, confronting angry sheriffs, and bringing messages of solidarity. Amelia was consistently invited inside events when professional media were kept out. We sought the immediacy and power of news coverage without its weight. We were strongly aware that tape depended on interaction, the tape depended on the interaction of maker, event, and community, and would carefully consider questions to those as these would construct the reality. At the same time, we tried to respond empirically to events rather than impose analysis. Karen Henri notes, in looking at the videos in Video Guide, that the strike tactics were productive, but the main result was that the women came to feel themselves as a capable and powerful force. In relevant political realms, the last tapes would be well received and their technical amateurness overlooked, for they present ordinary working women who are now finding their common voice. For us, we believe that the symbolic power of the camera evoked for these women a sense of history and identity through the process of being engaged in making the videos with us. In 1983, in part in reaction to the debates inside Amelia, I produced Heroics. Oh, that's inside BC Tel when it's occupied. That's me. In a residency at the Western Front, curated by Kate Craig and Tim Guest. In this 6-part installation, which was presented in 3 domestic sets, a living room, kitchen, and a foyer that suggested the transition to public space. Interested in the formalizing the interview process, indicating the constructed nature of terms and categories, and genuinely producing counter definitions, I sought out women who were willing to answer the question, are you a hero? Responding to an interviewer, Lefebvre, for Video Guide, I answered, it's not a sociologically accurate piece of work, but it uses some of those social history or scientific methods to ask the same questions to different people, and then look at their responses in some kind of consistent way. It does not pretend to be all that there is about women and their struggle with power. There are women in society who I believe are more oppressed, such as farm workers or homeless women in this series, and some of them are in the tapes. I tried to give people fairly equal time and allow the viewer to make the judgment. But I think that by just collecting, I make my own decision. I did edit for coherence. The work is heavily edited, unquote. I interrupted the narrative through imposing color photos on top of the interviews, and the viewer is situated within the comfortable yet uncomfortable reproduction of the domestic sets, choosing the stories they want to hear and often conversing with each other in the gaps between the beginning of the tape. Both Amelia and Heroics punctuated my larger project, which, like many of this period, was a combination of academic and deeply non-academic experience. I founded the Women's Labor Project in 1978 while still a student at SFU in the history department. I was a labor activist and had been involved in the organization of AUCC, an independent feminist union, with a focus on unorganized clerical workers at universities and colleges. I had worked on the organizing drive at UBC, was employed at SFU while attending school, frankly, in part to solidify the union, which had been certified. I later helped to lead the union into CUPE, which is the large public sector union in Canada. It was clear to me that there was a dearth of role models stories, formal histories about women's activities as labor organizers or activists supporting labor-related working class activity. My intention was both pragmatic and academic. I wanted to create a significant documentation of activists and create a reference for women and men organizing in contemporary times. I wanted to understand what motivated them and why some women led, others followed, and others did not engage. I wanted to understand what impacts their efforts had achieved, what had worked, and what had failed. I wanted to understand the ways that women worked in unions and if it was different from the methodologies that men used to exercise power. I wanted to understand demographic forces, such as marital status, race, indigeneity, cultural affiliation. I wanted to understand the role of politics and the various ideological positions that parties and our unions took in women's right to work, equality, the family, and how this played out. It was a big project, and once I began it, I worked on it on and off until 1995 when I completed my last video for broadcast and independent distribution, Fit to be Tied, about domestic and agricultural work. So I began doing deep archival research, and I'm just going to skip over here. But I was also very much impacted by critical theory of the time, in particular the Making of the English Working Class, a monumental book that uses large-scale oral history, interviews, and quantification to look for trends shaped how I looked at this research and now how I continue to look at data analytics to this very day. Debates on methodologies of interviewing, the importance of questions and the actual validity of interviews as documents were raging, and these were also formative. And this was a time when both post-structuralist, linguistic, and later performative assessments of research processes were underway, assessing both documents and gathered data as being subjective, and that all histories are revisionist. As my work rolled out, I benefited tremendously from the very generous environment at Simon Fraser University in the history program and the emerging women's studies program. I had collegial supervision from Richard Boyer, Alan Seeger, Brian Palmer, and Marilyn Stewart. And oral history was not an academic practice in Canada at this time, and the faculty I worked with were willing to let me explore and even learn from my adventures in this new realm. So between 1978 and 1981, I interviewed over 100 women using a life history technique and deposited these audio tapes with Simon Fraser, the BC Archives, and the BC Federation of Labour. I brought other interests to the field, which eventually played out in the direction that the research took. Although interested in academic writing, I was mostly concerned to make the research available to the people whom it would impact. I had dipped my toes into agitprop theater and had studied Bertolt Brecht and his writing and plays, and tried to apply his methods of constructionism as well as the work of Erwin Piscator and the development of epic political confrontational documentary theater. Although not yet enrolled in art classes, I had been exposed to the activist art and graphic designs of the late 60s and first half of the 70s, and was convinced, a la Enzenberg, that the left and the labor movement did not use effective communication tools. With performance artist and fine arts faculty member Bruce Barber's encouragement, I jumped headlong into the visual art courses at SFU and studied with Bruce and Jeff Wall and the entourage of talent he brought through SFU, Lisa Steele, Clive Robertson, and Martha Rossler. Wall and Barber were fascinated by the Weimar Republic and the Frankfurt School, and the practice of John Hartfield, George Gross, Raoul Hausmann, and Hannah Hawk in Berlin Dada with its highly interventional performances. Dadaist Franz Jung hijacked a German freighter in the Baltic, commandeering it to Petrograd as a present to Soviet Russia. It was quite a performance. And photomontage. Roland Barthes' mythologies, deconstructing the power of advertising, was deemed to be a powerful parallel to the work of Hartfield in the 20th century. Late 20th century, sorry. New objectivity, seasoned in locating the relations under the surface of real objects, names, and newspaper clippings. So I became increasingly interested in montage from found footage, inspired by Esther Schub, who said, and I quote, "Magical power of the scissors in the hands of an individual who understands montage, there is nothing like it." Unquote. Of particular current relevance was the idea of tactility. And it is at this intersection of intellectual and manual labor where signification is rendered palpable and a handling by the viewers encouraged by photomontage's tactilism in the context of photojournalism. And it sets up a homology between the labors of physical and ideological construction at the same time as serving as a model of transgression. So through my exposure to the labor movement, I'm not going to talk about this, I jumped into the video in through a project that I did, and I began to bridge the use of art-based methods, documentary deconstruction, and bring these ideas into the newly emerging direction of the Women's Labor History Project, using video art, experimental documentary, installation, and art exhibitions, and several television projects as well. The Labor History Project was a not-for-profit that supported 8 full-time staff. Over the years, employees include Zainab Fergie, Keynote, Miriam Giroux, Sky Fowler, Jennifer Abbott, Kelly Marlowe, and many others. It became clear that the advent of media was tremendous disruptive impact on local cultures that women had created as part of community building and activism. Issues of Indigenous rights reverberated throughout British Columbia. I'm just going to move through my slides. Sure. Issues of Indigenous rights reverberated through British Columbia from the 1970s onward. American Indian movement leader Leonard Peltier extraditions hearings took place in the Vancouver courthouse, now the gallery. Video and curated and collected videotapes about Indigenous issues, some by Indigenous makers, such as the Native American video newsreel, the demonstration, and the BC Association of Non-Status Indians council meetings, and coverage of the 1978 formation of the World Council of Indigenous People. The late artist and documentary maker Mike MacDonald was a Micmac Indian who spent many years in remote BC with his camera in the Nass Valley, North Central and West Coast, Skeena and Sitwin rivers. And in 1985, he gathered his documentation into remarkable work at Video In, Electronic Totem, a pole of monitors as monumental as Nan June's Pipes installations. Loretta Todd, writing in the fall 1987 video guide in an article entitled Native Video in BC, explained that white cultural missionaries brought video to Indigenous communities, believing Native people would join the global village, ignoring traditional forms of preservation that communities had maintained. They inappropriately turned cameras on the perceived exotica of dance, culture, and history. However, a positive byproduct was that Indigenous producers realized that video was affordable, developed communications networks and education, and media art was used as an educational tool in the struggle for self-government. I met Dana Claxton in the punk scene. She recalls that, quote, at that time I was fresh off a farm in Rosedale, BC. I had my beautiful garden and canned food and moved into the city and became part of the music and art scene. There were a few Native people, First Nations people in the punk scene. I had not become an anarchist. I did not take on the punk uniform, but I went to tons of demos, anti-nuke, Operation Solidarity, etc. And I remember my neighbor saying, why are you going to hear that band? You don't look like any of the women in that poster. Claxton describes the growth of the Indigenous media environment. She says, how I got into media at all was through the Shalakan Native Indian television news on Cable 4 in the mid-80s. We were all amateurs. It was pre-Aboriginal People's Television Network, and the idea was to train Indigenous people in television production, and we were trying to learn. There was an ad in the Sun, you had to be a woman, disabled, or First Nations. I qualified for a few of them. It was a training program that you got paid for. It was an incredible experience, founded by Larry Guno, a Nisga'a lawyer, very active in Nisga'a politics. He was also a survivor of residential schools. Loretta Todd and Leonard George and Mary Ann Jones, the young actress from the Beachcombers, started the Chief Dan George George Media School, which eventually morphed into the Indigenous filmmaking program at Capilano University. Dana continues. She said, once Indians were allowed to go to university, they went into law and education for obvious reasons. Art and film school were a luxury, really. A lot of people went to Spirit Song. It lasted for a decade. It was a really important place, and through Native Ed, they were eventually accredited. We were in the black box, below Women in Focus, and if you had a creative spirit, it was a foundational place for people to come and experiment. We would playwright, and I turned my plays into my short films, The Red Paper, and my performance media came out of Spirit Song. The Video Wins First Nations Access Program was created in 1992, initiated by Margot Kane, Zachary Longby, and myself, and while located and supported at the Video Win, it functioned as a self-government, autonomous entity producing 6 works over 3 years. This is Loretta. Inspired by EAT, Intermedia had been an early site of experimentation with computer arts, with an early focus on sound. In the 1970s, holographic artist and filmmaker Al Rizzutis and Jim Armstrong built an analog video synthesizer with a 16-channel quanticizer that they nicknamed Philips, which was capable of color video synthesis. They experimented with biofeedback, video feedback, film and video hybrid experiments at the Visual Alchemy studio of Rizzutis. He submitted himself to prolonged electric shock, which he documented in living color. He also was known for his structuralist film work. He then began to combine film with synthesized video. According to Al Rizzutis, when he offered Philips the synthetic kit to the Western Front, they rejected its output as impure, corrupting the technical qualities of videotape. By the time he left Canada after his confrontation with Kasia Silverman and Patricia Grubin in the SFU Film Department over feminism, post-structuralism, and narrative, the Western Front performed a volte-face and asked to adopt Felix, but Al instead shipped it off to Ontario. Corey Weingarten recalls that the Western Front provided opportunities for artists to learn about computer science. She said Bob Richards, aka Spencer Kelly, was an American draft dodger and an expert on submarine technology who had slept beside nuclear missiles. He worked at the Western Front and helped set up the beginnings of their electronic media. I learned what a motherboard was, although the workings were still a mystery. Richards ran a series of lectures on computer programming that I still recall attending. I can't believe I went off and actually got a degree in computer science after going to those lectures, but anyhow. Elizabeth van der Zag played a significant role as artist and teacher of computer-based approaches and effects. She studied at University of Western Ontario, taught at SFU, and worked at the CBC as an early digital video operator. By the late 1970s, artists sought computer effects, and Video Guide was an important source of technical information. In 1978, van der Zag provides a discussion of keying the computer image with a sync generator onto video camera results in a different method of montaging computer images onto videotape, etc. The Digit series was an interstitial feature on John Anderson's Gina's show, producing weekly for community television. Digit, a cartoon-like figure, had animated adventures with titles such as Digit Goes to Hawaii, Digit Responds, Digit Does the Dishes, Digit Reproduces, Digit Leaves, Digit Recalls the Future. And Baby Eyes, in 1983, created by van der Zag, used video processing with Japanese artist Ko Nakajima's Anapeter, a machine that allowed the user to draw on the video electronically. The woman world outside the filmic space are flipped as a baby point of view through graphic effects. In the late 80s, the Western Front had some basic computer tools for artists, but these were not available elsewhere in Vancouver. Van der Zag was convinced artists and media makers needed the tools and the related skills. She stated, after teaching electronic cinema and video at SFU, I started a multimedia school for artists funded by HDRC, which is our human resource development kind of part of Canada, called the Western Front Multimedia. It offered courses in computer arts and graphics. Computer art found an important home at Simon Fraser University. Barry Truax, Martin Gottfried, Doug Holland, and Jerry Barinholtz connected SFU, UBC, and the University of Victoria. Barry Truax was a composer, creating with the PODX computer music system, and author of the Handbook of Acoustic Ecology for the World Soundscape Project. He pointed out that graphics were far more computationally demanding, hence early experimentation occurred with audio. Tom Calvert, who led computer science, had a long-standing interest in art and technology. Technisch Horst, and he began a collaboration in the 80s that would last for many years. She was teaching programming at Douglas College, programming for a living, and studying secretly teaching and publicly studying dance at Simon Fraser University. She was fearful of revealing her programming skills to the dance program, lest they think that she was not a serious dancer. Tekla says, in my last undergraduate year, I was passing the computer science area, and I saw someone working with a wooden doll where they were bending the joints, and he had a PDP-11. And he was doing something with a stick figure, and it was not quite dance. It turned out he was working with Dr. Calvert. In the middle of this, I had this aha moment. Oh my God, I realized you needed programming. But I thought the dance knowledge I have, the embodied knowledge, is so much more technical than my computational knowledge, and nobody has ever thought of building a bridge between these two technical forms. It was that moment that changed my life. I told Tom Calvert I wanted to do the program in my movement analysis course where we were working, this project in my movement analysis course, we were working with Lefebvre. So I had to program and use my movement analysis training. She continued. As a graduate program student, I continued to work with Tom Calvert and Maurice Cunningham, exploring technology. We had life forms running. I'm looking for you. There you go. Okay. We had life forms running on this Macintosh computer. Part of that exploration was the promise of how technology could be a catalyst for how we might ask constructive questions like, what could movement be? For Maurice, it was all the mistakes he would make in using the computer. What became a polyphonic, fast-paced, sometimes robotic movements began to be used for movement by many young choreographers, not always using the computer. It had to do with asking ourselves, who were we and what our bodies are, and this relationship between meaning and meaning-making, unquote. Tekla describes her own choreographic responses. She says, I became interested in impossible dances, things that were physically impossible but left you exploring access to gravity, ways of moving the body in angles the body could not do, or the timing was so abrupt and polyphonic in ways that would blow up the timeline. It gave you an altered reflection of the human body and its capability, unquote. She began to expand dance beyond the body, anticipating the intranet of things. Quote, there was a chair, and just because you could, I mapped a beautiful movement phrase onto the chair. The chair was doing strange things, falling over and upside down, but there was something about the meaning of the dance phrase that was not lost, even though the model was a chair. It was discovering intelligence and movement itself that are perhaps tactile or implicit or just hidden, and when revealed may be uncomfortable, unquote. When the Image and Sound Institute Shipport created a CD-ROM based on interaction with large quantities of Cunningham's data from the movement archive, and then in the early 90s, I'm going to take 5 more minutes. Okay. John Crawford of Discovery Park and Shiphorst, with colleagues Martin Gottfried and Sang Ma, began SFU's summer computer arts intensives, which were, quote, large sandboxes using MIDI, sensors, Max MSP, and play between analog and digital. It included George Lewis, Louise Nevelson, Louis P. Demers, and Bill Vaughan, Pauline Oliveira, and many others. It provided historical and theoretical perspectives, prototypes, and performances. She describes the workshop as, quote, very improvisational and exploratory, based on this concept of interaction between the analog and the world of sensors. It was before organizational thought on how to map processes. We explored the relationship between materiality of the immateriality and the materiality of the body. The other thing that we did, which was every morning we held movement sessions and everybody moved, and different people led the sessions, and the concept was that you had to create this as part of the technological design process. There was a kind of ambient, soft listening where you're receiving rather than focusing inwards. With movement, how you see, how you use the eye, it created a different state in the body. And these are technical aspects of improvisation and how we direct our attention. You can map in different ways. We use that to produce not only the works, but the design of technology. To integrate into methodologies, there's a structure and there are rules. When SFU ended its funding of the workshops in 1994, the Computer Arts Intensive moved to the Western Front for several years before it ended, and Shipport became an installation artist exploring ways for audiences to enter, in her words, the liminal space, unquote. Vancouver, I'm just going to show you a little bit more of Tekla. And I'm going to add on a somewhat painful note. So Vancouver was home to lightning rod debates, crises, and confrontations around sexuality and sexual images. These had formed around the red-hot video outlet. Picket lines became a battlefront between and among feminists, artists, librarians, and civil libertarians regarding censorship, with crucible moments being the cancellation and effective censorship of confused sexual views by the Vancouver Art Gallery, the fight against restrictive provincial content regulation and screening and Canada Customs. In 1984, Luc Rambaud, the director of the Vancouver Art Gallery, at the 11th hour canceled the installation of this work, produced by Gary Bourgeois, Gina Daniels, Jeanette Reinhardt, and Paul Wong, overriding the lead curator, Joanne Bernie Dancer of the gallery. The installation used a direct-to-camera documentary survey mode in which individuals spoke to the camera about their attitude about sex. Rambaud proclaimed the works as not art and feared that these would offend audiences and bring down the wrath of the criminal code and the flight of donors. The title tapes column in the video guide captured the response of the media arts community, and I quote, "This outrageous action has instigated an explosion of controversy like the city has never seen. A specific incident has only been the tip of the iceberg, or rather ice pick, that has driven in the wedge, factionalized the art community, and brought to a boil the traditional versus the media arts, the activist versus the complacent artist, the politicized, the non-art for art's sake, and the avant-garde, a discussion long overdue in the city," unquote. The Canadian media arts community was immersed in battles against the Ontario censorship board, who had closed down Not a Love Story, a film critical of pornography, as well as a number of artists' works. In a video guide article, Clear About Confused, I noted that the not-art argument was specious, as the ironic use of semi-documentary formats of installation had fitted into 15 years of video art, and in fact, in other media, such as photography, that were exhibited regularly at the Vancouver Art Gallery. So the Vancouver Artists League organized a boycott of the VAG, letters of protest, a salon de refusé, and encouraged galleries to bring the work to the city. There was a mass rally at the annual general meeting, and artists were successful in achieving positions on the institution's board. Paul Wong unsuccessfully took the VAG to court. It was a downturn of the relationship between the media arts community and the gallery that lasted for years. Paul eventually had a retrospective curated by Chief Curator Dinah Ogaitis. But this debate regarding pornography and state intervention had heated up in society, and the feminist community, with artworks by gays and lesbians, alternate educational material about youth sexuality and erotica, targeted by Canada's customs and provincial censors. In November of '85, the BC Attorney General Brian Smith proposed sweeping regulation of all video materials and received support from Women Against Violence Against Women, the Anglican Church, and the Council of Women. There was no protection for videotapes or artist groups or galleries. As a spokesperson for the Vancouver Artists League, we were the only group to argue against the legislation. So the fight was on, and the strategy was to organize alternate works about sex in the video format for both education and provocation. So 2 events in Vancouver, the November 29th to December 1st Heat is On, Women on Art on Sex, were organized by a group of us, and they included screenings and panels such as sex tapes dealing with desire, a screening of recent work by women artists, coming together or coming apart. The Vancouver Artists League then initiated the Coalition for the Right to View, the CRTV, and in December 1985, under the banner Educate, Don't Legislate, to fight not only provincial legislation but Canada Customs and the extension of the criminal code. The coalition brought together many groups, feminist artists, video producers, writers, gay and lesbian organizations, librarians, and individuals who believe that censorship of video is the wrong solution to the complex problem of violence against women and children and violent pornography. We followed the Heat is On with visual evidence, a multi-month series entitled Of Multimedia Events about sexuality and sexual images at Video In. The Pitt International Galleries, Women in Focus, Heritage Hall, the Western Front, with education and provocation, including an evening curated by Double Jeopardies, Gender and Race, younger artists and sexuality, and a workshop for sex educators on the use of alternate erotic and artist video, learning to talk sex. and 2 porn production workshops, one for gay men, which was not well attended, and one for women that drew many women. In June of 1987, Mary Lou McCausland of the BC Film Classification Branch declared, quote, she was aware that the cultural event, Visual Evidence, was not submitting video material for classification. It was important that artists be free to explore and be creative, regardless of the results of their explorations and creativity, and that her office was prepared to exempt the series from the classification process, unquote. This represented a significant victory for artist-run centers and public galleries. So, to conclude, I just want to remind you of my points of interest here, the points of disruption, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about both. So what are the lessons, for whom and why? So this incredible intensive and productive re-radicalization that we're seeing in the current era in which we live, the value of interdisciplinary experience and collaboration, the need for complex institutional partnerships and a kind of pragmatism and understanding of their limits as well as their potentials, the importance of understanding the blend of post-secondary education and the value of new sites of experiential learning, and respect for leaders who come from inside and outside of the academy. The powerful autonomous and semi-autonomous nature of artists' organizations in Vancouver as a model, and the importance of pronounced internationalism and cultural race politics and expressions. The importance of Indigenous media arts expression within the context of the digital world, and the revivification of activities to counter censorship in an epoch when we're seeing, again, an incredible rise of censorship of not only artists but other forms of expression, and the importance of the social. So I'm very eager to hear your comments about this important period of time in Canadian history. Louise Althusser, writing in Ideological State Apparatuses, Notes Towards an Investigation in Video Culture, said that there's a value of detailed description, thick description one could argue, to unearth dynamics and contradictions. Descriptive theory is the first phase of every theory, at least in the domain which concerns us, that of social formations. One must envision this place as a transitional one, necessary to the development of theory, precisely as an effort of the contradiction, a development of a theory which goes beyond its form of description. Thank you for listening to my description.
First of all, thank you so much for this generous, amazing, rigorous talk. It just blew my mind, absolutely. And I would like to start with the beginning of your talk. You mentioned a couple of the interviews you did that many people, including Paul Wong, were not doing that to add a career, but they're just doing that, right? And you place a lot of emphasis. And listening to all those amazing history, the question that was in my mind is like, what we did wrong? Why is it like that? What happened? And one of my questions is how can, okay, so we started, they were just doing that, it was amazing, and now we're trying to change, and so how do we change to see the future? So how in the 60s and 70s, there was a sense of possibility and people were doing it, and now we have maybe more tools and more stuff, and seriously, the present state is not an open one.
You know, I'm a professional optimist. So I think there are some really I didn't have a chance to but when I talk to people, they were all very optimistic. You know, they believe very strongly in the power of artist formations and the integrity of those formations and the ways that they're models for political change in organization because of the ways that they include audiences, engage people, and provide them with tools. So I think that there's lessons from those points of success that are incredibly important. There is, there is a time when there's a kind of absorption of the experimentalist kind of video art practices into the mainstream gallery environment, but that just happens. And I think, we just have to understand that new practices emerge. And, there's we just flow into other places and create new kinds of resistances in terms of critical practice. I mean, I think the kind of activity that happened around censorship, around issues of sexuality and around inclusion are phenomenally important. And my hope is that we don't lose those lessons, that we don't have to refight those battles. And I think Kara Knight's point, which is to look at that archive and see how incredibly engaged people were in trying to invoke social change and to live out that practice. Maybe we just need to re-inspire ourselves consistently by looking back at some of that history, because it is quite amazing.
All right, one more quick question. Right here? I'll give you mine and closer.
Thank you, sir, for the talk. In a lot of that art making, there was a real pragmatism there. You're covering strikes, you're covering that sort of functional sort of behaviour. So I want just to get your perspective on that functionality of the art and whether that you feel it still continues within the BC scene, or is there still that influence going on? Is there still functionalism in that sort of thing? An agitprop, an activism or something like that? Because it seemed to me, at least in the presentation, that there was a strong element of activism underpinning, you sort of alluded to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a really, amazing hunger, not only to cover those issues, but actually to see others' experience. So the collection that the Video In has created and its library and archive, which are just absolutely phenomenal. I mean, there's nothing like it really in the world. And it needs to be protected and properly funded. But anyhow, I think there was a tremendous hunger in a lot of communities to have that sense of self-reflection. There's huge debates, about the quality of the work that's produced, how well it speaks to people, and the work gets more and more sophisticated over time. All these questions about verite and voice, echo throughout those years. And I do think that the tactical media movement very much took up a lot of those lessons. I didn't have a chance to talk about the Challenge for Change, moving the National Film Board, and the kind of theories of verite, but they're very similar to what's happened in tactical media and in citizens media, on the internet. So I think there are those continuities, but maybe with less naivety about, the ability to actually transform purely through media. I mean, that was a 60s phenomenon, the idea that information, simply having information is a transformative moment. And I'm not as familiar with the Vancouver scene as I once was, but I still see a tremendous amount of political work coming out of this part of the world, and a lot of those impulses are still there.
On this positive note, let's join our hands together for Sara.